welcome everybody to the November School of Health and Rehab Sciences monthly seminar series. And today we are featuring Stephanie Fertig, who is a program manager with the National Institutes of Health America's Seed Fund, otherwise known as the federal SBIR STTR program. Today, we look forward to your questions, but also hearing from Stephanie all about this program that has been around since the early 1980s that provides very, very early stage product development funding for emerging companies in the United States. It's probably America's number one source of early stage, non-dilutive seed funding that really can help companies, develop their products and grow them into products that reach the marketplace that satisfy needs of the federal government as well as satisfying needs of the broader U.S. economy and community. With that, Stephanie, I go to you. Hopefully, David, we're set up to share screen as well.
Well, I see it as an option.
Okay, awesome.
So let me do that and just thank you all for having me speak today. So let me be careful that I don't try to do too many things at once here. Hopefully you can see my slides.
Yes.
Excellent. So today we're going to talk about America's Seed Fund. And again, as was noted, the SBIR and STTR, or also known as America's Seed Fund, has been around for a really long time. But there have been some changes, and I'm hoping to also take the opportunity to, do a little myth busting today. So dispel some of the common myths that I hear. So I'm the HHS Small Business Program Lead. So I coordinate and manage the SBIR and STTR programs for all of HHS. That's NIH, CDC, FDA, and ACL. So it's actually a large program that spans several operating divisions within HHS. I always start by pointing people to the website because, when all is said and done, you may have questions after this, or you may want additional information on a specific topic, and their whole, conference is dedicated to the SBIR and STTR program. So I certainly can't touch on everything today, but I encourage you to go to our website for more information. Now, we really utilize our program to help turn discovery into health by taking those great innovations and getting them into the hands of the patients, clinicians, caregivers, and researchers that need them. As was noted, these are congressionally mandated programs, and it's about $1.2 billion here at HHS for small businesses. So that's a significant amount of money. When we talk about America's Seed Fund, we talk about SBIR and STTR. Now, the SBIR and STTR, one of the big questions that I often get is, what's the difference between SBIR versus STTR? And really, there are some programmatic differences. There are some specific differences, but it all comes down to the SBIR allows partnering, while the STTR requires partnering between a company and a U.S. research institution. That's the big difference. At HHS and within NIH, the big difference is that only NIH does the STTR program versus all those other operating divisions that I talked about. CDC, FDA, ACL, as well as NIH does SBIR. The other big myth that I do hear is that there isn't a difference in scope. So people think that one is earlier than the other. That's not actually true. At NIH, the scope and what you can propose in the application is identical between the two. Now, this is really the largest source of early stage capital for life sciences in the United States. And really it fits in that spot of proof of concept versus research and development. Now, NIH isn't like a lot of the other agencies. The small business program, multiple agencies do participate in that, but we tend not to be the final purchasers of our technology. We really use this program to help companies do the proof of concept and research and development needed to de-risk your technology, and we can provide support and then allow companies to leverage that support to attract NIH funding, to attract partners and investors necessary to take that innovation to market. So you're going to use that funding to attract those innovators and those investors and partners. So we've gotten a number of small businesses that have done this, and I encourage you to take a look at our small business success stories, in part to help you really see the wide depth and breadth and kinds of technologies that we support, because we support all sorts of innovations and different modalities, not just what you would normally think of as therapeutics or diagnostics, but also research tools, digital technology. There's even a bike helmet in there. So there's all sorts of innovations that we can help support that really look at a wide variety of diseases and disorders, and obviously all across the country. So when we're talking about these programs, they are phased. Now, these are not clinical trials phases. That is an unfortunate similarity in the nomenclature. Phase 1 is a feasibility study. Phase 2 is full research and development. Now, that comment about how this can support early stage, that's absolutely true, but you'll note that I'm not defining what feasibility study and full research and development means. And that's because there isn't a definition. And so I've seen people come in with very early stage things, maybe looking at assay development or earlier, and then I've seen people come in with things like clinical trials. And all of that can fall in the realm of the SBIR and STTR program. We have a number of different ways to come into the program. You can either come in as a standard phase 1 and phase 2, and then come in for a phase 2 after a successful phase 1. You could come in as a fast track, which combines the phase 1 and phase 2 together into one proposal. Or you can do what we call a direct to phase 2, which allows you, if you've already done the feasibility work for the phase 2, to come in, for the phase 1, to come in directly to the phase 2. Regardless of how you get to the phase 2, we do have a number of additional programs that can help support and really bridge the gap that sometimes exists between the conclusion of the phase 2 and the commercial market, or even a partner or investor. One of the big questions I get is around money. That is a really common question. So you can see the SBA guideline numbers here. And for those who are familiar with the program, these may look a little different from what you might have thought. And that's because they were recently updated thanks to inflation. So they do get changed with inflation every year. And so these are the new guidelines from the SBA. However, it's important to note that we do have a waiver that allows NIH and CDC to exceed these amounts for specific topic areas. Now, how much an individual institute or center is willing to provide, how much funding, is very specific to that individual and center. And so it's really important to reach out and ask if you're going to be going near or above these guideline amounts, to make sure you reach out and talk to a program officer in advance. So let's talk about myths. For those who are familiar with the SBIR STTR program, one of the big myths that I hear is it's much harder to get a fast track or direct to phase 2, so I shouldn't even bother applying. And I want to tell you that is a myth. While many of our new projects are phase 1s, we do support fast tracks and direct to phase 2s. If you look across NIH, the success rates are actually very, very similar. It is very institute or center dependent. And so again, it's really important to reach out to a program officer and ask what might make the most sense for you. I do point out eligibility criteria. I think it's important to note because I get a lot of questions around where the work can take place, and the work has to be done in the United States, and whether foreign companies can apply. And the answer is these are for US-based companies. So the rest of this is about individual ownership. That's another place where people have a lot of questions. Again, this is determined at the time of award, and I encourage you to look at our website and ask questions if you have any questions around eligibility. But the vast majority of our companies are very small. only a couple of individuals as part of the company and may be very brand new. We have a huge number of funding opportunities that are specifically targeted to SBIR and STTR. Most of these do follow standard receipt dates, September 5th, January 5th, and April 5th, 3 times a year. So the January 5th is upcoming right after the holidays, unfortunately. So these are due dates that are very, very similar. When you go to our open funding opportunities, you're going to find that we have what we call some general omnibus solicitations, as well as targeted solicitations. Now, within the omnibus, you'll see program descriptions and research topics. I encourage you to take a look at those, read them carefully. You'll find all sorts of information about the individual institutes and centers and how they utilize their programs. In addition, we do have targeted solicitations. It's important to note that not all institutes and centers participate in all solicitations. And so it's really important to read those targeted solicitations very carefully, as they may have very specific things that they're looking for or components that are in addition to what a normal standard grant application has. Which leads me to my next myth. I should apply to a specific program announcement because targeted funding opportunities have their own dedicated funding. And that's actually not necessarily true. So specific funding opportunities may not have their own targeted funding. They actually may not have their own specific review group. The vast majority of our applications are actually reviewed within the Center for Scientific Review. Most NIH awards, and that's about 80% or more, 80% or so, are made to applications submitted to the omnibus solicitations. So if you don't see a specific targeted solicitation, don't worry. That's why the omnibus is here, because we really do fund the majority through that omnibus. When you're looking at the omnibus, you see there's an SBIR or an STTR version. So remember when I said those critical differences, you can see those policies listed here. The really important thing to note, though, is that at the end of the day, it's really about what makes the most sense for your project. Who's going to be doing the majority of the work? Who's going to be the principal investigator? You really should be looking at, whether or not you have a strong nonprofit research institution partner or not. Regardless of SBIR versus STTR, the awards are always made to the small business. And it's important to note that the review groups, because these do go through NIH peer review, the review groups look at both SBIR and STTR applications alongside each other. So it's not like STTRs have a separate review group. Another big myth I hear. Since the SBIR is a bigger program, I have a better chance of getting an SBIR awarded. And I really want to bust this myth because it's an important one. The size of the program does not correlate with the chance of getting awarded. I'll actually say that again because it's so important. The size of the program does not correlate with the chance of getting awarded. And that's not just for SBIR, STTR, but this also means smaller NIH institutions, the smaller programs like FDA or ACL, or some of the other, operating divisions, across HHS. Just because there's a smaller amount of money doesn't mean that you have less of a chance of getting it. In fact, oftentimes those smaller organizations are really looking for great projects because people aren't applying there. So again, don't discount some of those smaller groups. One of the other decisions you're going to have to make is whether or not you're a clinical trial. I cannot emphasize this enough. It is extremely important if you're doing human subjects research to reach out and talk to a program officer in advance of applying. Strongly emphasize that because we have a much broader definition of what a clinical trial is. Not all institutes and centers you allow for clinical trials through their small business programs, so it's really, really important to reach out. And we do have a decision tool online, and I'm happy to share these slides at the end here, so you don't have to try to write everything down. But I will tell you that decision tool is really, really helpful. So another myth: My project is low risk and only has a few human subjects, so it's not a clinical trial. And that is not necessarily true. Risk and number of subjects is not part of our definition. So again, it's extremely important to reach out and talk with us. Now, SBIR and STTR, they go through the standard NIH review process. That means peer review. While it can take 6 to 9 months from the time of application to the time of award, most companies do get feedback 3 to 4 months after submission. So you'll have an idea of how you're doing earlier in the process. We do have electronic submission. For all of those who were maybe connected to a university, you maybe haven't had to deal with some of the grants management processing here. So I will tell you, these required registrations are critical. If you are planning to do anything for January 4th, when you're done here, sign off and immediately get all of your registrations in order. Like, that's the next thing you should do. If you're even contemplating coming in, because it can take a significant amount of time. These are electronic systems. Things do happen. And if there is an issue and it can't be resolved, you can't submit. And there is nothing my office can do about that. Nothing. I have no control over it. So it's one of the hardest calls that we get, because it's the calls that I can do nothing about. It's a really hard thing to do. We have a number of resources online on how to apply. I encourage you to take a look at those. In particular, we do have links to application instructions. I know they're 180 pages long, but they really are detailed. You can find a lot of answers to your questions there, annotated form set, and even sample applications, including summary statements. So you can see the kinds of responses that the reviewers had to those specific applications. If you're brand new and you have not received an NIH SBIR or STTR before, we've also got applicant assistance programs. I encourage you to take a look at those. There's some webinars for those that are coming up shortly this week. So again, if you are interested, strongly encourage you to look at the applicant assistance program as well. One of the big myths I hear, novice applicants to the program are almost never successful at getting awards, and I want to bust that myth here. About a quarter of our SBIR and STTR awards do go to new investigators to the program. We really do strongly encourage new applicants, particularly from underrepresented groups or underrepresented parts of the country. We really do want people, to come in who may not have been successful in the past. But really, the most important piece of advice is to contact us. Contact a program officer in advance. We do have a list of all the program managers for the program for each of the individual institutes and centers online. You can see which institute and center may be supporting your research area, and you can see that at NIH Reporter. And finally, you can always email my office, the SEED office, at seedinfo@nih.gov. We'll be happy to help connect you with the right program officer. But you'll see this at least a month before the deadline. That's because we cannot generate hours in the day. And unfortunately, people's calendars do really fill up. And there's nothing we can, we just literally run out of time. So it's important to reach out and contact us early. Another big myth I hear, applications are submitted to a specific institute. So I need to choose the institute and the study section for my application. And in actual fact, you don't. You are submitting to the NIH. The Center for Scientific Review then helps assign it to a specific institute or center and a study section or a review group. You can request somebody, but you don't have to. And just because you request an institute or center doesn't mean it's going to get assigned there. An important other thing to note is that the review group and the NIH Institute or Center, not necessarily correlated. So a review group may review multiple institutes and center applications. So you can have, applications from different institutes and centers in the same review group. So the peer review process, it's very similar to the standard peer review process that you may be comfortable with if you're used to the SBIR and through to the NIH review process. The scientific review officer recruits peer reviewers with the appropriate expertise in the small business community. That also means individuals with small business expertise or product development expertise. And they review those grants. You get at least 3 reviewers assigned to each application. And those reviewers use the review criteria to score the application. And you can see the different review criteria in the program announcements. So you, it does go through the standard peer review process. Now, only about 50% of the applications are discussed. This is again similar to other applications to the NIH peer review. Even if you're not discussed, you still receive a summary statement. So everybody receives a summary statement, but you may not receive a score if you're not in that top 50%. So here's another myth. My application didn't get discussed or funding the first time. That means it's a waste of time. And I'd like to bust that myth. And in fact, the vast majority of applicants do need to resubmit. Our tips are to please read your summary statement very carefully. Contact your program officer to discuss. You could find the program officer's name and contact information on the summary statement. And then most important, offer to be a reviewer. We are looking for good reviewers. There's no better way to figure out and learn about the process than to be a reviewer. If you're not sure how to be a reviewer, please drop us an email, seedinfo@nih.gov with your CV. We'll pass it along to the appropriate person at the Center for Scientific Review. Don't believe me, believe them. These are individuals who have successfully navigated the program. And I will tell you, even they who are very familiar with the program do have to resubmit. It is very, very common. Another myth, the scientific review group, such as the study section, determines if you're going to get funded. Not true. We use the score and the summary statement when developing the funding plan. The advisory council and review board, second level of review, has access to that score, but the final funding decision is made by the institute or center director. And so we generally know not all institutes and centers have a pay line. There's often not a pay line. These aren't percentiled, they just get a straight priority score review. And so really, again, it's not completely determined by the review group. The small business programs only provide money, and I'm happy to say that's definitely not true. We provide more than just money. I mean, not that the money is good. People do like the money, but it's more than just the money. There is something called a Technical and Business Assistance Program, or TABA program. These provide different kinds of technical and business assistance. Within an application, if you have your own vendor, you can actually ask for funding, TABA funding, in your application. But many of our first-time applicants or individuals to phase ones, we encourage them to utilize our central TABA service instead. That's the TABA needs assessment, to get a third-party unbiased assessment to help you determine what you should ask for in your phase 2, as well as what other services and things you may need to do to improve your commercialization plan. So the technical and business assistance is one example of some of the support that we can provide. Beyond technical and business assistance, we offer other kinds of innovator support, regulatory and business development consultants, partnering and investing opportunities, entrepreneurial support opportunities, a number of different ways that we can help our awardees and recipients kind of get access to those partners and investors and get prepared to transition. So I'm going to do my last myth, which is that NIH bureaucrats are unapproachable, and I should minimize my discussions with them. And I really hope you don't take that from this conversation. We're here to help you. We really encourage you to reach out to program officers in advance. And so with that, I'm going to have my contact is all here. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Feel free to come off mute, put it in the chat, whatever people are comfortable with. Not sure, as I said, it was kind of a fun start. It caused it to be a little bit casual. So I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has after that kind of whirlwind overview.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'd like to have this as interactive as possible. That's really our goal for this this seminar series that we're doing. So please, everyone, chime in with your questions. There's some you can put them in the chat. It looks like we have one in the chat now.
Great question about nonprofit organizations. No, they do have to be for-profit. They do have to be companies. A nonprofit can partner with a company, but the actual recipient itself does have to be a company.
Yeah, I'm curious if there is any collaboration between NIH and NASA, because they also have SBIR, STTR with health chapters under them, and they were not on the list that you mentioned as collaborating companies. So how do you stand with NASA versus NIH?
Great question. So the SBIR STTR programs are actually, these are federal-wide programs. And so within Health and Human Services, there are those operating divisions that I mentioned, the National Institutes of Health, Center for Disease Control, Food and Drug Administration, and Administration for Community Living. So those are all within HHS. However, Department of Defense, NASA, National Science Foundation, all of those different agencies and more do have SBIR STTR programs. So if you're in health-related, development of health-related technologies, other agencies may have SBIR STTR programs that could fit as well. Now, it's really important to note some of these agencies are focused on developing and then buying technologies. Some aren't. So for example, NASA tends to use contracts. We don't. So we tend to use grants. They tend to use contracts. They tend to be looking to purchase things. They want to put things on rovers and put things into space, right? And so they're looking really to develop technologies that they may potentially use versus us and others like NSF. We may be looking more to develop technologies that are going to be purchased and utilized by the American people. And so it more broadly. And so again, it really depends. We all do work with each other though. We have regular meetings. The Small Business Administration helps coordinate those. So we do work with each other, but we're often not, they have their own programs and their own ways of managing and doing the SBIR STTR programs. And I'm happy to send, I see a note on the chat, and I'm happy to send out around a PDF of this talk as well.
Yeah, that's something we could also post on the SHRS site as well, Stephanie. So if you forward it to myself or David, and then we can make sure that
happy to do that.
Everyone will have access to that. There's another question in the chat.
Yeah, I do see a couple in the chat, which is great. Is there an opportunity period to air the SBIR strategy with an individual? If so, what role and depth should be approached? Great question. And I think so there's grants and there's contracts, right? Contracts, there is a specific window where you are not allowed to approach program officers. There's a very specific window when you ask questions, you have to go through the contract officer, and it's very structured. And those questions and the answers to those questions are made public. There's kind of what we call a blackout period. The good news is for NIH, the vast majority of what we do are grants. Grants, you can come up and chat with us right up until the day you submit. I mean, the hour you submit. Now, I really don't encourage you to do that. I encourage you to contact us in advance, because if you're contacting me 2 hours before you need to submit, what I say is likely not going to be helpful to you as you're submitting, right? So please contact us well in advance. And I often tell people contacting us earlier is often better, because if you've got a rough draft of your specific aims, and then we say something that completely changes them, you haven't spent a huge amount of time writing out a very detailed proposal. You can make that pivot. A lot of people are really concerned. They're like, if I don't send the most perfect specific aims, they're going to think less of me. No, we won't. They're drafts. Put draft across it. There, now it's a draft. Now you don't have to worry about it. put a draft. It is better to come to us with enough information so that we can provide guidance, but it doesn't have to be perfect. Don't get obsessed with perfection. It is more important to reach out to us early so you can get on someone's calendar and make sure that you can get your questions answered and get feedback. That is actually most important. So really, from my perspective, it's more about approaching us in enough time so that you can get onto somebody's calendar and that you have enough time to take whatever information that they give you and provide to you and pivot and make what changes you need to write that most best proposal. Because what you want to make sure to do is give yourself enough time to not just write the proposal, but if you can, send it to a couple of people that you know. I always say, find the most critical individuals you know those people, they're the most critical ones. Give them your proposal and a red pen and tell them to go to town. Because how you're going to communicate with the peer review is through the written word. It is imperfect. You want to make sure that you are as clear as possible. And since you've been eating, sleeping, and breathing this project for however long, you're going to make assumptions. Your brain is going to fill in gaps just naturally. You want to give it to somebody who's not going to do that and make sure that you can communicate clearly to them as well with your application. Hey, do you understand what I was trying to say? Do you see any gaps here? And again, give it to the most critical person you know. That's key.
Stephanie, I usually counsel folks to send, their draft specific aims to the program manager in advance of a meeting. Is that enough, or would you be looking for more than that?
Actually, we can't look at more than that. I mean, and it's not, the specific aims are about the most that we can look at because we can't look at the applications for everyone, and we need to be fair. Fairness is a really core essential component of what we do. And so it's the draft specific aims are what you need to send. And what you're going to be asking them is, one, any questions about what they, hey, should this be SBIR versus STTR? Phase 1, fast track, direct to phase 2. Do you have any, hey, do you see this as a clinical trial or not? Is there any issues with your institute or center supporting this kind of research? Does this fall within your institute or center? Here's the amount of money I'm thinking about asking. Is that outside of what your institute or center would support? Things of that nature are the kinds of questions you want to ask, because again, each institute and center at NIH, and actually across all the components of HHS, each of us uses the program a little bit differently. You want to make sure that you don't spend all that time, all that energy and effort to submit and find that your application is above what a specific institute or center would support, or it's a clinical trial and gosh, that institute or center doesn't do clinical trials through SBIR STTR. So they might have another way to support those and you might not be aware of that.
Just to continue, myth 1 is probably out there because of me, Stephanie. So
not just you.
Okay. But, so I am always one that says, geez, if you're a first timer, haven't done it before, they don't know you, they haven't worked with you before, they don't know, especially if you don't have a strong CV and a lot of work, I always advise, let's go to phase 1 first. But you're saying, so I think what you're saying is, it's a myth, but talk to that program officer first to make sure it's a fit and it's something that would need to be, that would possibly be accepted. There's no guarantee of it being funded by talking to a program manager, but that would be a strategy for you to consider based upon that recommendation or a conversation with the program manager.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I was recently on a panel with 2 individuals, and both of them, it was their first time coming in to the SBIR STTR program, and both of them received a fast track.
How about that?
Now, how did they do it? Well, it made sense for their project, right? So it's all about what makes sense for the project. One of the big things is the differences between the 3 options. One big one is preliminary data. The phase 1 does not require any preliminary data. You do need scientific rationale and justification for why you're proposing it. Basically, you have to have a reason for thinking this is going to work, but you don't need preliminary data. A fast track which has that phase 1 and phase 2 in one proposal, it doesn't require preliminary data either, but there's an expectation that you're likely going to have preliminary data. Why is that? Well, that's because you're going to be combining the phase 1 and phase 2. You need to write a fully formed phase 2 before you completed the phase 1. You need the entire plan listed out, and often that does require at least some preliminary data to be, for you to figure that out. So it's expected that you're going to have preliminary data, but not required. And then finally, for a direct to phase 2, you basically need to show that you've already done the phase 1. So you've gone directly to the phase 2, and that requires a significant amount of preliminary data. I think for a lot of new people, because both the fast track and the direct to phase 2 require a commercialization plan, that's often very difficult for new individuals who are brand new to the process to write that commercialization plan. They're also longer. Again, for the direct to phase 2, it does have that increased preliminary data requirement. And for the fast track, the extra added trick to the fast track, it's a little bit trickier from a grantsmanship perspective. And that's because you've got to combine the phase 1 and the phase 2 into the page limits of a standard phase 2. So you're basically cramming all of that information into the page limits of a standard phase 2. That doesn't always work for every project. It's just some people require more space, more time. They may have more things, may be more nebulous in the phase 2, and that's why it falls down. So again, it really, really depends on the specific project. There's a question here about how important is the commercialization plan to the application. So the phase 1, so you actually can't submit a commercialization plan. There isn't a commercialization plan. But for the phase 2 or fast tracks, you do have to submit a commercialization plan, and it is important. You're really kind of showing the whole strategy. You're showing the significance. You're showing the innovation. You're showing how and why this is an important product and how this is different from what's come before and how it's really going to solve the problem that you've identified. And so it can be very important, particularly, and it does really, it factors into the overall criteria.
Great. There's another question in the chat too. When and where can we, recording of the script. Love to share it. David, I don't know how quickly the recording gets posted on SHRS, but it should be within a week, right?
Yeah, I think in a few days. We just need to just go over it and make sure.
Okay.
Okay.
And then another question, which is interesting, is could you please comment on switching agencies between phases? So i.e., I start in NIH, or maybe even institutes. I started NIH in my phase 1, and NSF's also interested and they want to fund the phase 2, or vice versa.
So I'm going to talk about switching in general. There's a couple of different ways that you can do switching. So one is switching between SBIR versus STTR, and you can do that between phases. So you can start out as an STTR in the phase 1 and then switch to be an SBIR in the phase 2, or vice versa. You can also potentially go between institutes and centers at NIH. That somewhat depends on, you'd have to be switching, you'd have to really have a significant shift in what you're proposing. I've seen it happen where, say, they started as a phase 1, really looking at one disease area, and in the process of doing that phase 1 discovered that really it doesn't quite work, because this is all proof of concept experimentation, right? So things do not often turn out like you think they're going to. But when they started doing work, they realized that it actually should be applied to a different disease area, or after looking at market research, or they've been doing their own research and realizing that they needed to pivot and maybe target a different area. And that requires that they are then assigned to a different institute and center. Now, usually what ends up happening is when someone submits a phase 2, it gets automatically assigned to the institute or center where the phase 1 was at. However, if again, there was a significant pivot, which means they should be moving to a different institute and center, there's a way to do that. And I've certainly seen that happen. Particularly, again, another common situation is where the phase 1 was maybe more of a platform technology, and the phase 2 really started focusing on a specific disease area, and that shifts them to another institute or center. And then finally, the thing that I've seen is a transition between agencies, and that does happen. So agencies would be like NIH and NSF, or DoD and NIH, or any kind of combination. So let's take a common one that I see, which is that someone gets an initial phase 1 award as part of the NSF program. NSF has a very broad mission space, and they fund very early technologies. And so sometimes they'll fund and support platforms, and they're going to be supporting that initial phase 1. And then as the platform or as the technology becomes more specialized, it really should shift to the NIH. And so what they'll do is a company will utilize that phase 1 that they received as part of their NSF or even other agencies, and then apply to us as a phase 2. And you can absolutely do that. You'll basically be letting NIH know that, hey, my phase 1 was over there, and now I'd like to come in as a phase 2 off of that phase 1, and you can do that in an introductory letter. I would just say, if you're going to be doing that, again, reaching out and talking to your program officials is really, really important, because there's a couple of things we can do to make sure that when you come in, it's processed appropriately.
Awesome.
I have a bit of a specific question. It has to do with the waivers on the budget limitations. At what point in the process is that approved?
Great question. So the NIH gets the waiver. So NIH basically goes to the SBA and says, we'd like the ability to make awards over this amount. And the SBA says yes or no. They've approved a list of topics. Now, when a company comes into a different institute or center, the institute and center has the ability then, has some budgetary flexibility, but they don't have to use it. And they're really then looking at that budget based on what's been justified in the application, what their budgetary situation is. And again, oftentimes institutes and centers have their own budget guidelines. So they might say, okay, we're not going to generally fund any phase 1s above, and I'm going to, some of them it's 300,000, some of them it's 500,000. So they'll put a general upper limit on their own and say, look, we reserve the right to make awards as we see fit based on what's in the justification and what our budgetary situation is. But in most cases, we allow for a general flexibility up to this certain amount for the things that fall under the waiver. We don't generally, and I mean we as in the NIH does not provide a waiver in advance of applying. What you come to the program officers with is you say, look, do you think, is this a budget that you would potentially, is this within the guidelines, your own internal guidelines? Is this something that, provided it's well justified, is this something that you could see within your guidelines? And they can answer yes or no, but they're not going to pre-approve a waiver for you. And that's because they want to see the full proposal and the full budget justification. They want to have that go through review and then make a determination. And so it's really, you're not seeking a waiver from us. We sought a waiver to even be able to consider those grants applications above that amount.
Thanks.
It's a little confusing. I mean, and it's just it's the nature of how the legislation is written.
I have another question that I wrote in the chat, but maybe it's better if I ask verbally. The way we present SBIR and STTR is seed funding for new companies, but I'm also curious, can it be used by more established companies for either new product or existing product, but a new application of the product, as long as they satisfy the SBIR and STTR requirements, such as less than 500 employees, more than 50% owned by US person, etc.
Absolutely. And so I think I tend to emphasize new companies because I think new companies sometimes get a little concerned that they're not going to be competitive, or concerned that, should I even apply? Is there even a chance? I think if you're an established company, I would say absolutely. What we're really interested in is, again, getting innovations into the hands of the people that need them. And so we certainly do have companies who receive more than one, have submitted more than one proposal and have received more than one award. So it certainly is it. Now, what we don't like is overlapping applications and overlapping proposals. We don't like to pay for the same thing twice. So make sure that you're not doing that. But certainly different projects, absolutely.
Could you kindly comment in regard to the scoring metrics that you apply? How do you rate various
Absolutely.
areas of the proposal?
Absolutely. So these do follow the standard NIH review. So what does that mean? There are 5 main review criteria that are individually scored in no particular order: significance, innovation, approach, environment, and investigators. So those 5 are the review criteria that will get an individual score when you actually get your review sheet. The 3 reviewers that are assigned are going to provide their comments on those individual scores. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with those individual review criteria and the scores because of 2 reasons. One, there are things beyond those 5 categories that can factor into the overall score. And 2, the overall score is not just those 3 assigned reviewers. So what do I mean? So the assigned reviewers will provide the individual criteria, those 5 scored criteria, and they'll have little scores next to them, and they'll provide their comments. And if you get discussed, it's going to be discussed. That application gets discussed by everybody in the review group, not just those 3 assigned reviewers. And everybody in the review group, after that discussion, gives an overall score. And the overall score that you receive on your summary statement is an average of all of those individual scores, not just the 3 reviewers. So if you give scientists a bunch of numbers, what are they going to do? They're immediately going to average them, but you can't average them because that overall score, the overall impact score, is an average of everybody in the review group. In addition, individual reviewers can weigh any one of those 5 criteria or even some of the additional review criteria differently and factor that into their overall score. So one individual may say, hey, but science significance really drove my score here. And somebody else will say, hey, approach really drove my score here. And their scores may be very different. And then finally, most frustratingly, reviewers sometimes don't update their individual criteria scores. So even the individual assigned reviewers may not go back and update those numbers because they've updated and provided their overall impact score, which gets averaged into that overall impact score that you get. And so again, I would see, how do I use the individual impact scores in the summary statement? They really are there to help you see what are the areas of your strength and what are the areas of weakness. But the good news is all of the individuals in the review, they kind of pull together and that's the average where you get your overall impact score. Another big question that we get is around the not discussed. So as I mentioned, 50% don't get a score. They're not discussed. That's the lower half based on the preliminary reviews of the 3 assigned reviewers. The lower half of the individuals don't get discussed. But here's a fun fact that a lot of people don't realize. Any one of the reviewers, assigned or not, in your study section can say, I think we should review this and it must be reviewed. Anyone can what we call save an application. Anyone can say, I think this one should be reviewed. We need to discuss it and we need to give it a score. Everybody has to, the flip side to that is everyone has to agree not to discuss an application. That's really important. So it isn't just one reviewer making the determination that something shouldn't get discussed. Everybody actually has to say, yes, we agree not to discuss this application. And I have certainly seen situations where one reviewer chimes up and says, no, I think we need to discuss this. I've read the reviews and I think we need to discuss it, and it gets discussed. So I hope that helps.
Is there any prior research or understanding of prioritization in regard to topic area, compelling need, anything like that, that would provide prior guidance as to how to achieve good scores other than just good execution on writing skills? Or
that's a great question. And I think, it's not so much about topic, because remember the review groups are kind of broken out into different topics, right? And so, I would say, everything kind of goes hand in hand. And it's really when we're looking at what makes a good grant application, it's being able to kind of communicate clearly that idea of what is the problem, that you're trying to solve this problem, and that you are substantially different from other things that are out there. You've really taken that into consideration, and you have a clear plan of execution, and that includes the appropriate team and access to resources, but also here's the stepwise approach. This is the next steps in the process, and here's kind of the clear go no go criteria after the phase 1 in particular that will tell us whether or not we should move on to the phase 2. So, unfortunately, some aspects of it are really about, straight grantsmanship, but it's also looking and making sure that you anticipate potential questions. So I'm going to state, if there is a debate out there in the scientific community about some component of what you're planning to propose, whether it's a theory, whether it's whatever it is, if there's that debate out there in the scientific community, it will play out in the study section, hands down, right? Because they are your peers. And I would say the best thing you can do to increase your chances is having other people look at your grant, particularly those individuals who have not been eating, sleeping, and breathing it for the past however long, right? Because again, what I've seen is the biggest difficulty people have is they make assumptions. They're writing things down and they're just skipping over things because there's a limited amount of space, and they don't even realize they're doing it because your brain is filling that all in. And look, I'm guilty too. Whenever I'm writing something, I do the same thing. So that's, that is definitely, there have been, my last thing I will state is look at the institute or centers, because some of them will have areas that they're particularly interested in. And so take a look at those, because since there is discretion around portfolio and interest areas, some institutes or centers have been very honest with saying we plan to prioritize the following. Not all do, some don't kind of have that kind of prioritization, but some of them definitely do. So take a look at that as well.
Thank you.
Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour. I'll just close this out and thank you again. This has been super helpful. And thanks for everyone for all the interaction. This has been great. Loved all the questions and especially the answers. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Let me give a plug for next month. Next month on December 12th, the seminar will feature, the title will be Jumpstarting Your SBIR Proposal Preparation. And this will be a seminar with Phil Brooks. Phil is a management consultant who has a strong financial and economic background. His company has worked as a grant consultant for SBIR phase 1s, phase 2s, fast track, broad agency announcements, and a number of other funding instruments through the federal government. He's also a preferred provider for Pennsylvania's Innovation Partnership Program, where he provides assistance to Pennsylvania companies that are submitting SBIRs, to any agency. So please make sure you sign in and register for that. It'll continue. It'll be a great continuation from what we've learned today from Stephanie, and then also help you to begin to prepare on how to prepare that SBIR proposal.
And if nothing else, do your registrations now.
Yes, you are so right. I'm working with someone right now, and they got stuck in SAMs, and like Stephanie said, the agency couldn't do nothing about it. We had to continue, and eventually got through there. But the SAM registration itself took 6 weeks.
And
Yeah,
you do
so-
have to renew that registration as well. That's a yearly renewal. So I do, make sure that those registrations are critical.
Right. All right, start the registrations and talk to the program managers.
Yep.
So, again, thank you so much, Stephanie. We really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us.
Not at all. Great to see
Very,
everybody.
very informative.
Very much.
And I'll stop promoting Myth 1, I promise.